Y'all caught me without my glasses on, the special occasion glasses, that is. Okay, we're going to read Linda Lael Miller, Big Sky Wedding. And on the back it says, The First Lady of the West, #1 New York Times bestseller author Linda Lael Miller cordially invites you to Parable, Montana, where love awaits. Wedding bells are ringing in Parable, Montana, but Brierley Parish has not enjoyed the sound since being jilted at the altar by Hutch Carmody. She's over Hutch now. She's running a multi-million-dollar business is challenging enough for the country gal, so she should be avoiding falling head over boots over heels for an A-list actor named Zane Sutton. He's come home to his rodeo roots, but Hollywood turned away once and just might again, yet everything about him, from this easy charm to concern for his young half-brother, seems too genuine to resist. Zane didn't come to Parable for love, but count on a spirited woman to change a jaded cowboy's mind. Problem is, Briley's not convinced he's here to stay. Good thing he's determined to prove to her, kiss by kiss, that she's meant to be his bride. So, this has been a long time in the making. I know some of you have been like, hey, wait a minute, you didn't do that one first. So I'm sorry that I skipped doing your book review on this one. And we're going to start in tonight. Like I said, start in. I look for this one to be a long book review. Just saying. Let's start with the letter from Linda Lael Miller. Dear reader, we're back in Three Trees, Parable, Montana, where the wedding bells just keep ringing. Big Sky Wedding brings you the story of Brierley Parish, a heroine who hasn't been so lucky in love, only interested in running her multi-million-dollar business. She has no plans to hear those bells for herself anytime soon, especially not with Zane Sutton, an A-list actor playboy who's come back to his rodeo roots. Briley's not convinced of his charm or that he's home to stay, but Zane's not given up. The hard-headed cowboy is determined to make her see she's meant to be his bride. Love is in the air at Big Sky Country, and I think we're all ready for these two to take a big whiff. Happy trails, and thanks for the listen. With love, Linda Lael Miller. Okay, we're going to the first paperclip of importance. That'd be page 14. What are you doing here? The sprite demanded, finding her voice at last. She took a few marching steps toward him, evidently thought better of coming too close, and stopped while there was still a safe distance between them. Her emphasis on the word you, though slight, chafed Zane's hide a little, since, after all, he wasn't the one trespassing on somebody else's land. Now, was he? I live here, he replied reasonably in his own good time, standing with his feet planted slightly apart and his arms folded. The irritation he'd felt was short-lived, quickly replaced by a sort of amused delight. Whoever this lady was, the fact that she might have rescued those clean but otherwise shabby clothes of hers from somebody's rag bag notwithstanding, she was most definitely a looker. She didn't come any closer, nor did she say anything, but it seemed, though, that she was lost some of her zip. And Zane couldn't resist adding, were you just hugging that tree, or was I imagining things? She blushed then, and her cheeks were going a glorious peachy shade of pink. Her mouth was wide and expressive, inherently kissable, and now that they weren't standing so far apart, he could see that her eyes were hazel. The color probably changed depending on what she was wearing in her present mood, or even the weather. I was doing a personal growth exercise, she informed him stiffly, as though an idiot would have known without asking, and Zane could tell that she resented him even that much. She was proud and stubborn, he decided, and competent at everything she did. But what the devil was a, quote, personal growth exercise, unquote, exactly? Something she picked up watching the Oprah Winfrey Network? He walked slowly towards her and put out his hand for a friendly shake, hoping that there'd be a message that he wasn't fixing to pronounce. Zane Sutton, he said, by way of introduction. She looked at his hand and then his face, then ran both palms down her thighs of their jeans before shaking the offered hand of a full nanosecond. Brierley Parish, she said, giving up her name ungrudgingly, like it was a state secret. And I knew who you were without being told, thanks. Clearly Briley Parrish was not impressed by his stardom or anyone else's. And he liked that. He liked it a lot, because he'd never been all that dazzled by the phenomenon himself, based as it was appearances instead of reality. Then you have an advantage, Zane replied mildly. Briley cocked her head to the one side, studying him skeptically. You actors, she finally said, not quite scoffing, but coming really close. That was page 14, 15, 16. Zane chuckled. I like to consider myself a recovering actor, he said. Please, she said, and though there was a mockery in her tone, she wasn't being sarcastic. Her hands were still on her hips, though, and her chin was jutted out, and everything else about her warned, stay back. You don't think we can recover? She sighed, considering the question. I'd say it's highly unlikely, she decided at some length. Show business people are show business people. Which means... You come and go, you buy and build ridiculously big, elaborate houses, not just in Montana, but in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona too, all over the West. In fact, basically scarring the landscape and squandering natural resources. You get your high horse on boycotting things, beef for instance, thereby putting good people out of business and generations of honest effort. You get involved in local politics just long enough to cause lasting problems, maybe start a few bitter feuds among the local yokels, and then you sell your property to some other famous so-called idealist know-it-all and move merrily on your ruin, yet another community. Zane gave a long low whistle of amused exclamation. There was some truth to her words, maybe a lot of it, but he didn't like being lumped in with all those well-meaning but too often fickle celebrities. Hello, he was a rodeo cowboy at heart, raised in the country by a woman who waited on tables for a living. The movie stuff had been thrust upon him, greatness not included. Why not just come right out and say what you mean instead of sugarcoating your opinion? So I feel all warm and toasty and welcome, he jibed. Page 17. Briley sagged a little in her shoulders as though sighing with her whole body. Most of us were hoping that you wouldn't show up, she said, that you'd just let the ranch sit there instead of hitting 3 trees like some kind of consumer stormtrooper, putting in the media rooms, restaurant-style kitchens, and the Food Channel would envy. Tennis courts and indoor swimming pools, the Olympic size, of course. Gee, Zane answered dryly. Thanks for the generous assessment. Seems like you're assuming a lot, though. Am I? Yes, I believe you are. You don't know a damn thing about me, Miss Parrish, except that I used to live and work in Hollywood, and I happen to like the house that I'm in now pretty much the way it is, except, of course, for the antiquated plumbing, the dry rot in some of the walls, the missing floorboards, and the sagging roof. Oh, and I'll be glad when I switch the electricity on later today, I admit, but you'd probably view any improvements as conspicuous consumption unless I miss my guess. You won't stay, Brierly said flatly, after giving his words due consideration and then obviously dismissing them, and him. You'll see, he replied, every bit of nettled as he was intrigued. Page 18. And at the end of their first conversation, she went one way and he went the other. Hardly encouraging in the start, in Zane's opinion, but a start nonetheless. Something, God knew what, but something had just begun. He knew by that strange tightening in his gut, and whatever it was, there would be no stopping it. By this time, he crossed the creek again. He was grinning. Let's see here. Well, it looks like we're going to go to page 24. So, keep on going on it. Briley stormed back to her office warehouse just beyond Zane Sutton's property line, her emotions veering wildly between fury and chagrin of all the people in the world who might have caught her in the middle of a sincere effort to ground herself via a method she'd learned in the motivational seminar held up for the salespeople. Why did he have to be the one? Snidely, her German shepherd greeted her with a wagging tail and a wide dog grin as she entered the building by the back door. Since it was Saturday, the office and the warehouse workers weren't around, so she felt like her faithful companion had the place to themselves. Normally, Brierly enjoyed the peace and quiet and got a lot done. Usually the weekday interruptions weren't a factor, but that day she'd like to vent to someone, anyone. For the time being, Snidely would have to do. We have a new neighbor, she told the dog, who as usual seemed fascinated by every word she said, however unintelligible to the canine brain. He's smart aleck and he's arrogant as all get out, and darned if he isn't way too good looking for his own good or anybody else's. Mine, for instance. Brierly locked the back door behind her and headed across the wide concrete floor of the warehouse toward the nondescript cubicle of the office. Snidely, the most devoted of dogs, naturally followed tail, still swishing back and forth. Eyes were hopeful. Not that anything was to worry about, she ran it on, Chantilly in a sing-song voice, because, like most of his breed, Zane Sutton will move on to greener pastures sooner than later, if we're lucky. Why did that prospect give her a swift, sudden pang? She stepped behind her desk, army surplus, no frills like the rest of the furniture, and booted up her computer. Her company, Decor Galore, was an international operation all over the world. Hostesses held parties in their living room directed by one of her salespeople, aka independent contractors, in return for a carefully chosen gift and discounts based on total sales, and invited their friends and relatives to buy wall hangings, figurines, prints of classic paintings, bouquets of exquisite silk flowers, and every conceivable kind of candle. When Brierly started Decor Galore less than 6 months back, she'd been a one-woman sales force, setting up home parties, lugging card tables and that was page 19 going to 20, page catalogs around the county, selling them items she'd either imported or purchased at wholesale. At a gift show, now she had over 1,000 people signed up to sell, and except for the local discount store at the Native American casino just over the Idaho border, she employed more people than any other business owner in the area. She expected the kind of success to be a lot more satisfying than it was, though. Not that she'd ever admitted that much to anybody, especially after she'd been so driven, worked so hard. Now she had money enough to last for 3 lifetimes, never mind 1. She had a closet full of beautiful custom-made clothes, which she never wore unless she was conducting management meetings or leading sales seminars. She could live anywhere she wanted, go anywhere she wanted. Over the past few years, she traveled to every continent on the earth, staying in the best hotels, dining in the finest restaurants. Perhaps more than at least her way of thinking, she helped put Three Trees, Montana on the map. Her sales conventions brought hordes of people to the town, people with money to spend. She'd set up scholarships for high school seniors in both Parable and Three Trees, and damn it, she made a real difference. So why wasn't she happier than she was? Frowning no nearer to answering that question than before, Brierly went online, scanned the sales reports filed by the district and regional sale managers, the movers and the shakers who headed up teams, drove company cars, took exotic all-expense-paid vacations, and, to a woman, earned at least twice as much money as a president of the United States, even in the current whitewater economy. As usual, the managers were outdoing themselves and doing their level best to outdo one another, too. The result of all this constructive competition, which was actively encouraged, more money. Another record quarter. Why, if she chose to, she could even take Decor Galore public, walk away and do whatever she wanted to for the rest of her life. Unfortunately, she wasn't entirely sure what that would look like. Would she still be herself, or at some point some woman she didn't know? Once upon a time, she was engaged to Hutch Carmody, a rancher from over near the town of Parable. Brierly had thought that she had it all figured out. Sort of a romantic slam dunk. She loved Hutch. She would have his babies, be content to be his wife and a mother, I'll bet a very rich wife and mother, and grow old alongside her undeniable sexy man. That was her plan. Of course, things hadn't worked out that way. Hutch had called off their wedding, and without any fanfare either, not ahead of time, when she could have saved face, sent the gifts back, canceled the 5-tier cake, uninvited the guests, talked to the photographer. No, she'd been standing in the church entryway in her wedding dress, her arms enveloped through her brother's walkers, about to step into the next phase of her life, when her devastatingly handsome, that was page 21 going to 22, bridegroom had suddenly broken rank with his best man and preacher and walked halfway down the aisle and said, "Hold it." Remembering, Brierly squeezed her eyes shut for a moment. Even now the humiliation was vivid, visceral, and an actual ache in the middle, like an aftermath of a hard punch. Oh, but time heals most wounds, or at least desensitizes them a little. She'd eventually made peace with Hutch, and he was now married to a former Kendra shepherd, also a Parable, and they had 2 beautiful children, with another one on the way. They were happy, and Brierly certainly didn't begrudge them of that. Just the same, There were still times, like now, when she would flash back to the whole scene. When it happened, it seemed like the proverbial rug had been yanked out from under her feet all over again, leaving her breathless, figuratively wheeling in her arms a hopeless attempt to maintain her balance. Once the internal roller coaster stopped, she logged out of the program of her computer, rested her elbows on the edge of the desk, her face pressed into her palms. She wasn't going to get any more work done today. She might as well accept it. Snidely gave a small, sympathetic whimper and rested his muzzle on her thigh, lending her what comfort he could. Brierly lifted his face and gave a broken chuckle and tousled the dog's ear. "If I ever meet a man who's half as loyal as you are," she told Snidely, "I'd marry him in a heartbeat, even if I had to hog-tie him first and drag him to the altar." Snidely whined again, and as if it was agreement. Brierly bent and planted a smacking kiss on the top of his sleek, hairy head and pushed her desk chair carefully so she wouldn't run over one of Snidely's paws. "Let's go home," she said with gentle resignation. Home was the family ranch, Timber Creek. She and Walker owned it jointly. Though Walker ran the place and did most of the work involved, Brierly and Snidely lived in a spacious apartment added on in the behind of the kitchen, and those quarters had always suited her just fine. She spent most of her time at decor galore anyway. Now, though, Walker had married his sing-song cowgirl sweetheart, Casey Elder, whom Brierly loved dearly, as though they were two teenage children, Claire and Shane, and their new baby, 3-month-old Preston, and Casey and Walker were adding on to the house. They planned on having several more children, and happy chaos reigned. As hard as her brother and sister-in-law tried to include her in things, though, Brierly felt like a third wheel, even an intruder. Walker and Casey were still on their honeymoon, even a year after the marriage, and by the way, those two loved each other. They'd probably be perpetual newlyweds. They needed privacy and family time. Page 23. Besides, Brierly was beginning to feel like a spinster aunt. The legendary old maid, hovering on the fringes of everybody else's lives. Was it so wrong to want a home, a husband, and children of her own? Was it too much to ask? After all, she had a fabulous business, one she built with her own 2 hands, and bearing global financial catastrophe. Money would never be a problem. Maybe it was just too greedy to want more, especially when so many people didn't have enough of anything, including the basic necessities of life. That's page 24. Okay, we're moving on. Page 56 is a short paragraph. When an image of Brierly Parish seeped into his mind like smoke, he nearly laughed out loud, as if, he thought, she'd probably already written him off as a hedonistic, interfering movie star. But even if she hadn't, she checked all the online gossip sites and found his name on practically every one of them. Moving forward. Okay. 67, 68, 69, and 70. "Who's we?" Cleo asked bluntly. "Huh? You said we're roughing it, plural. Have you taken up with some pretty cowgirl? Is that why this is all about? You suddenly wanting your housekeeper back and all? Because there's somebody you want to impress?" Zane laughed. He hadn't, quote, taken up, end quote, with anybody, though he did want to get to know Brierly Parish a little better. Okay, a lot better. Quote, "It's just me and my kid brother and my dog Slim," he replied. "And I'm warning you, Cleo, we're a motley crew." "You mean Laundry's there with you? Did he split up with that crazy wife of his again?" "No," Zane said, feeling no particular need to comment on Laundry's marital situation. "I mean Nash." "Who's that?" "You're going to have to wait and find out for yourself," Zane answered. "The situation defies description, over the phone at least." You get me that ticket," Cleo blustered, letting the Nash question go for the time being anyhow. "I've got my computer turned on and I'll be watching for the new messages." Again Zane chuckled. "I'm on it, Cleo," he promised. Nash gave the remaining half of his banana to Slim, who gobbled it up eagerly. Page 68. "First class," Cleo reminded him. "As good as it's done," Zane said, glaring at Nash and shaking his head, as in, "Don't do that again." Human food wasn't good for a dog, and that meant Slim wasn't going to have it. 15 minutes later, he was bought back online, purchased Cleo's one-way first-class ticket in seat 3B, and zapped a copy to her L.A. "Who was that?" Nash asked conversationally. By then he and Slim had been outside and then returned. "That," Zane answered, logging off and shutting down the lid of his laptop, "was Super Cleo. She can bend steel with her bare hands, leap over a tall building in a single bound, and she's faster than a speeding bullet, too." No sense adding that she was wide as she was tall, with ebony skin and gray hair, and stood out around her head like a frigate fright wig. A person had to meet Cleo to comprehend her, and even then it took some time. She yelled and flapped her apron when she wanted the kitchen to herself, and then she got a tongue sharp enough to slice overripe tomatoes and clean us over off the oft-mentioned whistle, but she also had a heart as expensive as the big Montana sky. Nash's brow furrowed. Now that he showered and put on his clothes that would get him beat up on school grounds, he looked his age, which was an improvement over former parody of 40-something homeless person in need of psychopathic drugs. Page 69. This Cleo, is she your girlfriend? He asked suspiciously, an indication that his previous experiences with girlfriends, probably his father's, had been memorable for all the wrong reasons. Zane laughed again, partly because he was amused at the idea of Cleo as his mane squeezed, and partly had to hide the stab of sympathy he felt for Nash in that moment. Nope, he said, with a shake of his head. Cleo and I are definitely not romantically involved. Nash looked relieved and a bit sullen. I guess we'll have to buy another bed then, he said, because from what I gathered, she doesn't seem like somebody who wants to sleep on an air mattress. You're right about that, Zane confirmed with a chuckle. If we know what's good for us, we'll have all the appliances, including a washer and dryer, before she gets here. Something changed in Nash's face. It was indefinable shift that might have meant he was beginning to trust this hairpin turn in his life and luck, or simply that he was mentally reviewing some of Felina's plan B, like burning down the house in a dead of night or committing murder with an axe, or both. Do I really get to stay here? The boy asked very quietly. Zane had to swallow before he answered. Yep, he said, you really get to stay here. Zane, what? Page 70. Thanks for not calling me Studebaker, Nash said, or Edsel. No problem, Zane replied, hiding a grin. Do you run into that a lot? Okay, moving forward. I would like to see us get to page 100 before I quit reading tonight, but we'll see. Page 77. Is this your dog? Brierly demanded furiously when she come within a dozen feet of the man and then suddenly stopped in her tracks. It was though some kind of barrier or force field had slammed down between them. Yep, Zane said after taking out the nails of his mouth and dropping them into the pocket of his beat-up jeans. They certainly didn't fit his image, those jeans. Was he trying to look as if he belonged in Montana? He's mine, all right, Brierly sputtered for a few inglorious seconds. Did it ever occur to you to feed him once in a while? Zane opened his mouth, closed it again. His grin was so insolent and so damn sexy that she would probably have slapped it right off his face if her personal principles allowed, which, of course, they didn't. A boy came out of the house just then, also shirtless, and sprinted toward them. Slim, he called just jubilantly. I wondered where you wandered off to. Zane flickered a glance at the gangly child of preteen, actually on the verge of a rapid growth spurt. Brierly Parish, he said quietly. Meet my kid brother Nash. Nash looked so pleased to make her acquaintance that what remained of Brierly's animal rights lecture died in her throat. Hello, Nash, she said after swallowing. The boy turned shy, blushing extravagantly. Hello, he murmured. Zane seemed to take the final exchange mildly amusing. Take old Slim into the house, he told Nash quietly, and see if you can get him to chow down on some kibble. That was page 78. Here's 79. If I can get the paperclip off. Nash hesitated, glanced at Brierly again from underneath the thickest eyelashes that he'd ever seen on any guy, except maybe Zane himself, and whistled low to summon the dog. The two of them vanished inside, and Nash reluctantly Slim going for the flow. He's a stray, Zane said presently. I haven't had him long enough to fatten him up. Brierly was flummoxed. She steamed over here on a mission of justice and mercy, and now suddenly she was becalmed, a ship with no wind in its sails. The boy or the dog? She asked. Zane's smile was affable and with a twinkle to it. Both, I guess, he said. By then Brierly felt like a complete fool. She assumed the worst. Movie stars, that disrupted now you see them, now you don't class of people, rarely proved her first impressions of them wrong. This one had, though, and that realization left her tongue-tied and embarrassed, wishing she hadn't come on like a storied gangbusters of full of accusation and spitting fire. Oh, she said. Zane's smile eased into a sexy grin. Is that all you have to say? He asked, obviously enjoying her discomfort. Oh? Heat burned in her cheeks, and she knew her eyes were flashing again. If you were waiting for an apology, she said, don't hold your breath. Zane leaned in a little, and she hadn't realized how close they were together standing, though one of them must have moved. She felt like his substance, his energy, and his every cell and nerve like some kind of biochemical riot. Now, why would I expect an apology, he drawled, though he seemed more amused than angry, just because you rolled onto my land like an armored tank and flat out accused me of animal cruelty. Brierly Blake swallowed. The dog's ribs show, she said lamely. Asked too many moments had passed, anyone would think. He had been going hungry for a while, Zane finished when her words fell away in midstream. As it happens, he wound up in a good shelter in L.A. just a few days before I adopted him. I've been giving him old Slim as much kibble as he can handle, Miss Parrish, but it's a slow process, requiring patience and understanding. Brierly longed to melt into a puddle like the Wicked Witch of the West in the Wizard of Oz. She wanted to say she was sorry, too, that she jumped to conclusions, but her throat had constricted like the top of a drawstring bag pulled tight. Damn her Parrish pride, anyway, it would be the downfall for her, sure. Idly, Zane stepped back, collected his shirt from a nearby fence post, and shrugged it on. For Brierly, this was both a relief and a crying shame. All that spectacular man-muscle covered up, hidden from the view. Thank heaven. Or, darn it, whichever. He turned his attention to Snidely, then bent over to favor the dog with a few pats on the head and a grin that left no doubt of love for his four-legged furry people. On that score, at least Brierly had misjudged Zane Sutton, no doubt about it. But she still couldn't bring herself to apologize. It just wasn't her pride, either. She had a vague and very disturbing sense that she'd be opening a door to a whole slew of unpredictable developments if she dared let her guard down, even for a moment. Come inside, he said finally. I can't offer you an iced tea or a mint julep, but we do have sodas and tea. I could probably rustle up some coffee if you'd rather have that. Oddly, it never occurred to Brierly to refuse the invitation. She simply followed Zane toward the house, shamelessly enjoying the rear view, while Snidely trotted along her side, oblivious to the fact that the planet had just shifted off its axis and the Ecuador could suddenly become the new North Pole at any given moment. By then, the boy, Nash, was in his kitchen trying to look busy. He pulled on a t-shirt, and Slim, the slat-ribbed dog, was crunching away a recently replenished supply of kibble. Brierly looked around, remembering, eased some of her tension that made her smile. Her friend Carrie's mom, Donna, had both taught her daughter and Brierly to cook in this kitchen, imparted simple sewing skills, listened to benevolently to the ceaseless girl chatter about boys and 80, 81, 82, cheerleading tryouts and prom dresses, driven them to school events and movies. You've been here before, Zane observed quietly, watching her. His words startled Brierly out of her reverie. Yes, she said, my best friend Carrie used to live in this house. There was so much more to this story, of course. Donna, recognizing Brierly as what she was, basically a motherless child, had made room for her in this house and in her heart. The Jackson had been her second family. Nash and Slim were both staring at Brierly now. Did she have something in her teeth stuck to the heel of her shoe? Zane moved to the refrigerator, the same one that had always been in that spot, unless Brierly was mistaken, and opened the door. What'll it be? He said. Soda? Water? Nothing for me, thanks, Brierly said, feeling like one of the birds who occasionally flew into her warehouse and got trapped there, wheeling and swooping in increasing desperation as it searched a way out. I really can't stay. Nash moved to the card table in the center of the room and drew back a chair in a manly flourish. You can't leave yet, he said with a grin, gesturing for her to have a seat. You're the only person I know in this godforsaken place, except for my brother, and he's practically a stranger. Brierly sat down, slightly mystified. Nash had charm, and he exhibited good manners by offering her a chair, but what was up with calling Montana, the place she loved, the best place on all the earth, her soul's true home, God-forsaken? Nash is used to finer digs than his old neglected ranch, Zane explained dryly when Brierly proved to be at a loss for a reply. With a weary sigh, he sat down opposite of the rickery folding table. You know, homeless shelters, juvenile detention centers, maybe a bunk in a rusted-out camper in somebody's backyard now and then. Brierly's eyes widened. Where she came from, which was right here in Parable County, thank you very much. Those were fighting words. Yet Zane's tone was unkind, merely the matter of fact, and she thought her family relationships were complicated. Nash, left to stand the odd man out in a game of musical chairs, leaned casually back against the counter and folded his underdeveloped arms. There was something very reminiscent of Zane about that posture. The man-child smiled winningly and said, "As you can see by the way my brother treats me, I am in a drastic need of a friend." Brierly smiled back at the boy, amused at the same time concerned. "You've come to the right place, then," she said. "Three Trees and Parable are both great towns, and I'd be glad to introduce you around to starting with my nephew, Shane. He's about your age, and my niece, Claire, too." "Is your niece as beautiful as you are?" Nash asked smoothly. Zane laughed and shook his head. "Next he'll ask," that was 82, 83, 84, "what your sign is, or look puzzled and ask if we've met before." Brierly liked Nash, even though he was half her age and too smart alecky for his own good or anybody else's, so she ignored Zane's remark. "And you're how old?" she countered lightly. Nash reddened underneath her kindly scrutiny and seemed stuck for an answer. Brierly would have bet that didn't happen very often. "He's 12, Zane supplied graciously. Nash glared at his brother. 12? Impossible, Brierly thought. "Going on 45, she said. A short silence followed, the air between the two brothers so charged that Brierly wouldn't have been surprised to see thunderclouds forming beneath the ceiling. "I could show you around," Nash said finally, volunteering, effectively rendering his older brothers invisible as far as he was concerned. "I mean, since you haven't been here in a while and everything." Zane sighed at that and raised no objection, but was he ashamed of the place? It was pretty dilapidated, and an unlikely abode for an established movie star, certainly. "That's a great idea," Brierly said, pushing her chair back. "I'd love to see a look around this place." She glanced at Zane, who was standing now. "You don't mind?" "I don't mind," he confirmed. The twinkle in his eyes, the twitch of the corner of his mouth, said he knew all full well that she didn't really care whether he minded or not. "We're getting more furniture after the renovating are done," Nash hastened to explain. "Right now we've got a couple of beds and an air mattress, and that's about it." Following Nash, with Snively right behind her, Brierly suppressed a smile. "Things take time," she said. The house was empty, just as she remembered it. Large and rambling, with spacious rafted rooms, tall windows, and a total of 3 natural rock fireplaces. There were 4 bedrooms and as many baths, along with a sizable dining area and a living room that not only ran the full width of the house, but offered a magnificent view of trees and mountains and the endless pageant of sky. "Cleo gets here tomorrow," Nash announced. When they come full circle about 15 minutes later and returned to the kitchen, Zane and Slim were both gone, and Brierly caught up the rhythmic tap-tap of a hammer somewhere nearby. "She was my brother's housekeeper when he lived in L.A. Brierly offered no comment. She was just glad that she hadn't followed the first inclination and jumped to ask who Cleo was before Nash got around to clarifying that for her matter. So Cleo wasn't a girlfriend or worse yet a wife. Brierly felt like a damn fool for caring either way, but she did care. 84, 85, 86. "I guess she can really cook," Nash went on to a conversationally, "but Zane says she's a stickler for neatness and order, and she'll raise hell when she gets here and look at this place." He paused in a breath and went right on talking. "We ordered a washer and dryer and another bed, but we're holding off on other stuff because Cleo's the type to want to say so in just about everything." Brierly smiled, amused by this assessment of the unknown Cleo. She sounded like a SoCal version of Opal Denison Beaumont, the local force of nature. "That's probably why," she said. Suddenly Nash looked wistful, and his gaze was fixed on something, or someone, very far away. "You don't have to tell Zane or anything," he said very quietly, "but I kind of like it here." Brierly rested a hand on the boy's shoulder, touched to the core of her heart. "Why would you want to keep that from your brother?" she asked, searching in his face. If she'd known Nash Sutton better, she would have put her arm around him just then, the way Donna Jackson had done so very often for her, and given him a squeeze, promised him everything would be all right. Since just they met, though, she knew that would be overstepping, and she'd done enough of that for one day, accusing Zane of neglecting, if not abusing, his dog. A muscle bunched in Nash's jaw, and a fly buzzed against the torn and rustled mesh in the screen door. The sound of the hammer sifting through on a June breeze, fragrant with pasture grass. "Because this is temporary," the boy finally replied, feigning nonchalant, and definitely avoiding Brierly's gaze at the same time. "That's the way my life goes. Everything's temporary." The backs of Brierly's eyes scalded, and she didn't speak for a moment, fearing her voice she would catch if she did. Sure, she missed having a mother continuously on the scene, both as a girl, sometimes even now as a grown woman, but she always had her dad, and Walker had a slew of good friends, including the Jacksons, and from the sound of things, Nash was alone in this world, allowed to hang around until someone decided he was in the way and sent him packing. Seeing Brierly's expression and reading it all too accurately, Nash turned up the wattage on that killer grin of his, so like his brother's. He might have been only 12, but he trained himself to act and talk like a man, and that saddened Brierly. Sensing as she did that he missed out on so much of his childhood, skipped right over it. "I wasn't trying to make you feel sorry for me," he said. Too late, Brierly thought, but she smiled to hide her sympathy. Pride seemed to be all about the Nash that had to call his own. "I live on the next place over with my brother Walker and his family," she said cheerfully. "We have lots of horses, and there's always plenty of extra supper. Breakfast and lunch, too, for that matter. You're always welcome to drop by any time." 86, 87, 88. "You don't have a husband?" Nash asked. Apparently, having noticed the omission when she mentioned Walker and company, he sounded somewhat surprised, which was a compliment, she supposed. "No," Brierly said, rustling up another smile. "This one was harder to come by than the last one, though. She might have had a husband by now if she had that God-given good sense to pick anybody besides such commodity for a partner. I'm single." Nash frowned as though he might be trying to work out an Einstein-worthy equation in his head. "And you live with your brother?" The question gave her a pang, but it also amused her a little. "Like you," she confirmed. She leaned slightly to give her dog a pat on the head. "Snidely and I share an apartment on the premises, so don't picture me sitting in a rocking chair in the attic knitting socks. I'm not exactly the maiden aunt." "Aren't you?" taunted the inner voice, the one that never let her get away with a darn thing. Nash actually laughed this time with a boyish delight that made her think of Shane. "Snidely? That's your dog's name?" Brierly grinned all the way. Already on her way toward the screen door, she stayed too long. It was time to make an exit. "Yes," she replied, glancing back over her shoulder for Snidely Whiplash. Nash looked puzzled. "Who?" Brierly sighed and opened the door to step out onto the porch, which was like the rest of the house, had seen its better days. "Don't kids watch cartoons anymore?" she countered in the pretend despair. "Look him up on the internet." Nash made a salute-like motion with his right hand. "Yes, ma'am," he said in a passable western drawl. "I'll do that." Outside, Zane had stopped working on the fence and turned to watch the road where a truck was slowing down to swing in at his gate, hauling a horse trailer behind it. As Brierly looked on, oddly stricken again by the sight of him, a slow grin spread across his face, the kind of grin that put a person in a brilliant sunrise following a long, dark night. The driver of the truck got out, opened the gate, and drove through, got out again and closed it behind him. Slim, probably figuring he ought to earn his keep somehow, barked a couple of times, which got Snidely started. "Shh," Brierly said, shielding her eyes from a sun-dazzled of shiny silver trailer, and Snidely quieted and sat down obediently at her side. Zane, meanwhile, awaited, shirt open, teeth gleaming in his tanned face, his hands resting on his easy, lean hips, making Brierly think of an old-time town marshal or sheriff, there to welcome a wagon full of trail-weary travelers yearning to settle down for good. Brierly knew well enough that she ought to go on about her business instead of standing there staring the way she was, but she just couldn't help it. This is page 88, 89. She shifted. 90. Her gaze from Zane to the truck and the trailer and back again several times. Nash fairly shot from the house. Apparently he hadn't seen or heard the arriving rig right away, and the smile on his face was downright transcendent. "Black Jack's here," he called to Zane. Zane nodded and swallowed visibly. "Black Jack's here," he agreed. His voice was the side of raspy. Black Jack, it turned out, was a magnificent gelding. His shiny coat was dark as coal, and as Zane, the truck driver, unloaded the animal, the creature tossed its gigantic head, mane flying, and looked around as if to say, "Home at last. Why did it take so long?" Zane took the lead rope from the driver and spoke in a low, easy tone and urged the horse the rest of the way down the ramp onto the hard-rooted ground. Brierly knew horses. She knew she'd been raised round them, ridden them with her dad when she was barely 2 years old, by herself or with Walker just about every day since then, and she'd never seen a finer animal than this gelding. With his ebony coat and silky mane, his conformation was nigh on perfect, and the sight of him brought an ache of admiration to her throat, a twinge of envy to her middle. Unable to resist, she stepped forward. "Stay back now, ma'am," the truck driver said. "This horse has been riding in that trailer for a long time, and he's likely to be a mite on the skittish side." Zane didn't look at the man. His gaze was on Brierly. And he didn't hesitate to speak up. "The lady knows what she's doing," he said, with a quiet conviction that caught Brierly totally off guard, caused things to tip over and spill inside her, warm and thick and sweet as honey fresh from a hive. Oh, Lord. She could dislike Zane Hutton when he was being obnoxious and arrogant, but his obvious respect for her expertise with horses was a game changer. She approached Black Jack slowly, let him sniff at the back of her hand before stroking his long face and velvety nose. "Well, hello there, handsome," she said softly. Black Jack nickered again, but he didn't sidestep or back up. The truck driver, reassured, gave a low laugh and said, "I bet he gets that reaction from every woman he meets. Love at first sight." He paused, shook his head, and resituated his worn-out straw hat. "Lucky critter." Zane handed the lead rope to Brierly, take the clipboard to the other man, and offered the sign for the delivery. Still carefully, to move slowly, Brierly led Black Jack away from the trailer, walking him around in wide circles so he could work some of the kinks out of his legs and get used to the feel of the solid ground under his hooves. Nash stood at a slight distance, clearly fascinated and probably a little scared too, and silently Brierly gave the boy credit for good sense. After all, Black Jack, 90, 91, 92, must have been measuring 17 hands at least, and he had a giant warrior's heart pumping away in that broad chest of his, sustaining over 1,000 pounds of sheer muscle, all of which meant he was a very powerful, very unpredictable animal. Even a well-trained and familiar horse could be spooked unexpectedly and frightened a horse that was a dangerous horse. For all that, Black Jack clomped alongside Brierly, calm as a dog on a leash. And just being that close to nearly mythic creatures thrilled her ranch kid heart through and through. She had given him just about anything to mount that gelding, or with or without a saddle, give him his head and let him fly like a Pegasus, but it was too soon, of course, and even though Zane had gone up a notch in her estimation by trusting her around Black Jack, well, that didn't mean that he let her ride. Some people, especially men, being famously territorial, wouldn't share their horses, period. Furthermore, while Zane had somehow sensed her competence, he had no way of knowing that, like her, the older brother she rode with, skilled or seasoned Apache, was on the warpath. All these thoughts were going through Brierly's mind when the truck driver tucked his clipboard under one arm, shook Shane's hand in farewell, and after one last admiring glance at Black Jack, climbed back into his truck, started the engine, made a broad turn, and drove off. Now the empty trailer flashing the aluminum bright as it rattled down the rutted dirt driveway. Zane appeared at Brierly's side, gently took the lead rope from her hand, and gave Black Jack an affectionate pat on the neck. Nash didn't venture any closer, and both dogs trotted over to join the boy, evidently bored with the proceedings. "It's just me," Zane asked in a low voice and a little husky, "or did something change between you and me a few minutes ago?" Brierly's heartbeat quickened, and so did her breathing, and she actually thought she might be hyperventilating. And she felt the cheeks heat up a little, too. She couldn't look directly at Zane for fear of what she might see in his eyes, but she wasn't going to lie either. "Maybe," she allowed cautiously. Then, with more certainty, she added, "Thanks for not assuming that the little lady didn't know one end of a horse from another." Zane chuckled and inclined his head in the direction of the rapidly disappearing truck and trailer. "I think that guy's intentions were good," he remarked. "He just didn't want you to get hurt after all." "Nice of you to give him the benefit of the doubt," she said, miffed. This time Zane laughed outright. "Strange," he said, with a shake of his head. "I could have sworn you just thanked me for not writing you off as a greenhorn. And what point, Ms. Parrish, did you give me the benefit? Did you or did you not accuse me of starving my dog?" That was 92, 93, 94. She was cornered like a queen on a chessboard with no moves open. "I can sometimes be sort of contrary," she admitted, though it practically killed her to concede that point. "You? Contrary?" Zane grinned down at Brierly, as at ease with her as he was the horse, and waited for her to answer. The implication was clear enough. He could handle them both. Brierly might have kicked him in the shins just then if it hadn't been for an aversion to physical violence. The discouraging thing was, she was every bit as intrigued by this man as she was irritated by him. If Zane had tried to kiss her in that moment, for pity's sake, she probably would have let him. What was wrong with her? "Go riding with me?" he asked. "Tomorrow sometime, I mean, presuming you own a horse." Brierly blinked. Of course she owned a horse. In fact, she owned several, since half of Timber Creek Ranch belonged to her. You could show me the countryside, he said. When she didn't speak right away, an impish grin danced in his eyes. That would be a mighty neighborly thing to do. Suddenly Brierly's palms began to sweat. She ran them down her thighs of her jeans, wishing she didn't like the idea quite as much as she did. Okay, she said, turning to the point toward home. That ranch house, the barn a couple miles away. You can't miss 'em. Time, Zane prompted. Late afternoon, Brierly heard someone answer, using her voice. I have to work. And I have to fetch Cleo from the airport, Zane said, so how about 5 o'clock or so? There'll still be plenty of light, and the heat might let up a little bit by then, too. Make it 5:30, Brierly said matter-of-factly, feeling though as she just accepted a dare to a bungee jump off a high bridge instead of a simple, harmless invitation to go horseback riding with a new neighbor. And it's a date. It's a date. She could have kicked herself for that phrase, her reply that way, but there was nothing for it. The damage was done. She blushed again. Zane grinned with that devastating grin, the one that fairly set Brierly back on her heels. 5:30, he said. See you then. Right, she said, somewhat awkwardly. She waved goodbye to Nash, turned away, and startled back towards the woods, snidely keeping up the pace as always. She was barely aware of the trees towering around her on the creek, or when she crossed it, making her way from rock to rock as before. Snidely chose to swim to the other side, reaching the opposite bank where Brierly was waiting for him. He slodged up the stream and shook himself mightily, showering her with a shining 94, 95, 96 diamond of ice-cold water, causing her to whoop in a good-natured protest and then laugh right out loud. It wasn't smart or safe to be this happy, she decided, even as her heart took a wing and soared against the periwinkle sky. Okay, we're going to read up to 141 tonight. So here we go. 139. Just what is it about me that scares you, he asked. There it was again, that no-holds-barred directness that always seemed to catch her off balance. Brierly opened her mouth and closed it again. Who says I'm scared of you? She challenged when she found her voice. I do, Zane said in a matter-of-fact tone. You take offense about every other word that comes out of my mouth, for one thing, and this might just be my take on the situation, but I don't believe you're always so prickly. If you were, you couldn't have built an essentially people-based business from the ground up and turned it into a mega concern. Just when she was prepared to be totally irreparably irritated, he complimented her, albeit in a backhanded way. She was proud of her decor de galore. Justifiably so, and he was right about something else, too. She was, in a general, a very nice person. You think I'm prickly? Truth be told, she was a little hurt. Yeah, Zane answered with another lethal grin. I do. I think you're prickly when you're around me, anyway. It's like you're expecting me to give you trouble, so you shoot quills like a concerned porcupine as a preemptive strike of some kind. Why is that? Since she couldn't rightfully deny the porcupine theory, Brierly turned pensive, rolling the matter around in her mind for a few moments, trying to get a handle of the cruce of it all. Normally she would know her own mind, wasn't given to bouncing back and forth between thoughts like a pinball in an arcade machine. Did those even exist anymore, or were they obsolete? I guess I'm wary of celebrities, she finally said. It wasn't as much, but that was all the mental search produced. Including your very famous sister-in-law, Zane asked. Casey's different. Maybe I am too, he suggested. And maybe you're not, Brierly argued, although with not much spirit. It probably isn't necessary to remind you that we get more than our fair share of movie stars out here, following some sort of fantasy they picked up during a guest spot on Little House on the Prairie, looking for peace and quiet and who knows what else. Zane studied her, arching one eyebrow just slightly. You object to the big houses, the landing strips, what? He spoke reasonably. I would imagine the Hollywood crowd pumps a respectable amount of money into the local economy. A little of that went out of Brierly's sails. She sighed. There's work for a while, carpentry and plumbing and that kind of thing, she conceded. They move in and everything's great until it isn't. Some of them even try to become part of the community. And then, Zane prompted. And then they get bored and they leave, Brierly said. The party's over. The big house stands empty. Forlorn. Blah, blah, blah. Sometimes for years, and another hot shot moves into the place if they haven't decided to put up a brand new monstrosity of their very own, and then the whole process repeats itself. Ah, Zane said, that was all just ah. It was, although the pieces of the puzzle that Brierly had just fallen into place in his mind, and he'd come into some profound understanding on the deepest and most secret self. Brierly was terribly afraid he was right. Uh-oh. Hold on a second. Okay, I think we can conquer up to 147, and that'll be it. Had he just stuck his damn fool neck out, or what? Zane asked himself, shifting in his saddle, a place where he seldom uneasy and readjusting his hat for the umpteenth time as he awaited Brierly's response to the impromptu supper and a movie invitation. Now it was too late. He could think of all the kinds of good reasons why he should have kept his mouth shut. To start with, it was too soon for even an innocent get-together like the one he suggested, and practice instincts warned that he was moving too fast where Brierly was concerned. Practical, independent, and in no way needy. She was nothing like Tiffany, or any of the other women he ever got entangled up with, for that matter. And getting to know her, not just superficially, but deep down, would be a slow process requiring finesse, patience, and just about every other virtue he could think of. He might as well just toss out all the supposedly he knew about the fairer sex, too, he realized, because with Brierly the ground rules were different. Not that he figured out what in the hell those rules were exactly, because he hadn't. Brierly was beautiful but earthy, and she had a substance, a quality that went way beyond the physical. She was also skittish, and understandably so. So if all that stuff posted on the internet about her and Hutch Commodity was even partly true, he'd seen the pictures and had to swallow hard when he thought of her standing there at the jam-packed church in Parable, looking like a storybook princess in her wedding dress, clutching her bouquet, confused and furious, and behind it all, very, very hurt. Whoever this Commodity fool was, he had all the sensitivity of a grizzly bear with a toothache, and Zane had already made up his mind not to like him, should they ever cross paths in the first place, which they was almost certain they would, given the Parable and Three Trees, the 30-mile distance between the notwithstanding. They were basically one town, people-wise. Hutch Commodity, what a kind of low-down, yellow-bellied S.O.B. waited until the wedding was in a full swing before opting out of the marriage anyhow. Bellegarde, Zane finally set those particular thoughts aside, as they wouldn't lead him anywhere he wanted to go. The reasons for not having company that night, especially this company, continued to rack up in his mind. These passel of circus bumper cars were all heading for the middle at once and crashing into one another. To start with, the house was shambles, worse than shambles, and in L.A. neighborhood a place like this would have been condemned. 142, 143, 144. And as far as supper went, well, there wasn't any decent food to speak of. Canned ravioli definitely wouldn't fill the bill, and since he had not bothered to bring along his TV when he left California, the only way to watch a movie, his or anybody else's, would be to hunch in front of his laptop like a pair of birds crowded together on a short stretch of wire. Not the idea of sitting close, the closer the better, in fact, to Brierly Parish was under just about any circumstance, didn't have high in its points, but things had to be done right, damn it. Not okay, not passable, but right. This get-together was important, though. Zane didn't feel inclined to explore the reasons why he thought so, and he knew from experience that sometimes a man only gets one chance with a woman like Brierly. They didn't come along every day, after all. Zane sensed that this was one of those times, dangerously pivotal, and he didn't intend to blow it. Furthermore, he told Cleo that they'd go into town for the stuff that she needed to make the house at least semi-fit for human habitation, and Nash was expecting to score a TV, probably for the first one he ever owned. Breaking a promise to a kid was no way to build trust, now was it? Furthermore, it was a just Sutton move, for sure. Get somebody's hopes up and then decide not to be bothered. And there it was, that one person in the world Zane didn't want to emulate. It was his waste-of-skin father. Maybe another time, Brierly said, almost gently bringing him back from his mental meanderings. She looked earnest, sitting there on that little gelding's back, even elegant, but at that same time mildly apologetic. Late afternoon sunshine glowed in her glorious brown hair like an aura woven directly in the strands, and he saw a certain reluctance in her eyes, along with something else that wasn't so easy to name. Never looking away from his face, she paused, but bit her lower lip, and finally went on, with a shaky effort and smile. "You're still getting settled, and all, and how about coming to our place instead, you and Nash, and Cleo, of course, say Saturday night? We could watch a movie then, all of us, and Casey says you two have met before, so she's planning on asking you over anyhow. He wanted an out, Zane thought, and lo and behold, Briley had given him one, along with an invitation for Saturday night. This was a good thing, so why did it feel deflated all of a sudden, as though she just shut him down, as though the main chance that had come and already gone, and with him barely noticing it never to come around again? All these emotions were foreign to Zane. Being a relatively uncomplicated person, he shook them off. He knew he'd known Brierly Parrish for a day, and she was already making him crazy, which was either the worst possible preview of coming attractions or the best. I know Casey fairly well, he confirmed smoothly. We did a made-for-TV movie once. It would be good to see her again and meet the rest of the family. 144, 145, 146, and 147. Of course, Briley was using kinfolk as a buffer to establish a way to be polite and a safe distance between them, but when he ventured onto her turf, but that was okay. Take things slow, cowboy. Who knows what that's all about? Don't know what that's all about either. Let's get back to this. Briley's face lit up and was a word... Okay, take things slow, cowboy, Zane told himself, really slow. Briley's face lit up suddenly. Was that it, the word family, that knocks Zane back on his figurative heels a little? The woman actually glowed like a figure of an angel in stained glass window flooded with sunlight, and the sight of her hit him where he lived. My niece and nephew will be thrilled to meet you in person, she went on, gathering momentum, and Shane, that's my nephew, of course, is just a little older than Nash, so I think they might enjoy each other hanging out together. She shifted the gelding's reins in her direction of home, a subtle clue that the ride was over, and that the time being, at least, Briley preferred to go her own way, and let him go his. Sounds good, he said, by the way of acceptance, and tugged the brim of his hat, time-honored way a cowboy bidding a lady so long. And Briley Parrish was most definitely a lady. I'll get back to you with the details, Briley said, fully at ease now, smiling. What had changed about all of us getting together for supper, I mean? Zane grinned to himself. Given that she'd just issued an invitation on her sister-in-law's behalf, she'd probably have to clear the plan with Casey. All right, he agreed, reining Blackjack toward his own place. Thanks for showing me around, Briley. I enjoyed it. A soft peachy pink color blossomed in her cheeks. As though stuck for a reply, she swallowed visibly and nodded, but said nothing. That would have to do for now. You're welcome, Zane decided, amused and already looking forward to Saturday, which was probably went to prove that he was a little shy of a truckload in common sense department. Page 146, 147. Oh, heck, 157's just a paragraph. How did you and your hot date go anyhow? Nash asked companionably with no preamble whatsoever, so he lugged his newly acquired TV still in its box across the yard, following a path of light spilling from the open door Cleo just passed through. Zane hadn't been thinking about Briley, but the old days and Mattie Rose and how he and Laundry had been the thickest thieves when they were young. He took a moment to register his brother's question and then answered not unkindly, That, boy, is none of your damn business. Okay, we're stopping at page 190 tonight. We'll pick up there. Hopefully we'll get a book rating soon. But we made a very big dent tonight. So hope you're enjoying Big Sky Wedding. And you'll get more of it in the future. So stay tuned.